The October rain fell heavy against the windows of the small apartment as Sarah Mitchell stood in the kitchen, mechanically stirring a pot of pasta. Her hands moved on autopilot while her mind churned with 1,000 anxious thoughts. Behind her, 3-year-old Emma sat at the worn dining table, pushing peas around her plate with the tip of her plastic fork. The kitchen was cramped, barely large enough for 2 people to move without brushing shoulders, but it was home. Or at least, it had been until 2 months ago when everything began to unravel. Sarah glanced at her daughter and felt the familiar ache in her chest, that crushing weight of helplessness that had become her constant companion. Emma used to sing. She used to dance around this very kitchen, belting out off-key renditions of children's songs while Sarah clapped and cheered. She used to laugh at the simplest things: a butterfly outside the window, bubbles in the bathtub, the way Mommy made funny faces. But that Emma seemed to have disappeared. The little girl sitting across from her now was a pale shadow of who she'd been. Withdrawn, silent, her bright eyes dulled by something Sarah couldn't quite reach. It had started when Michael filed the custody papers. Sarah's ex-husband hadn't been interested in Emma for the past year. He'd missed visits, forgotten her birthday, and generally treated his parenting responsibilities like an inconvenient obligation. Then suddenly, out of nowhere, he changed his tune. He wanted full custody. More than that, he wanted to paint Sarah as an unfit mother. The allegations were vague at first, claims that she wasn't providing adequate supervision, that she was emotionally unstable, that she was neglecting Emma's developmental needs. But they were also devastating in their reach and resourcefulness. Michael came from money, old money, the kind that opened doors and hired the best lawyers in Indianapolis. His family owned commercial real estate across the city, and they'd made it clear they were willing to spend whatever it took to rescue Emma from what they called an unstable living situation. Sarah's apartment wasn't fancy, but it was clean. She kept Emma's room bright with drawings and stickers on the walls. There was always food on the table. There was always love. But love doesn't show up on financial statements. Love doesn't impress judges in courtrooms. Sarah had been forced to hire a public defender, James, who seemed competent but exhausted, carrying the weight of dozens of cases on his shoulders. She tried to hire a private attorney, but the quotes were astronomical. She made $32,000 a year working as a medical office assistant and another $12,000 from weekend shifts at a retail store. After rent, utilities, and food, there was nothing left. No cushion, no resources, just survival. The legal process had been cruel in its efficiency. First came the summons. Then came the appointment with Child Protective Services. Social workers had shown up at her workplace, twice, asking questions that made her stare. They'd visited the apartment, opening cupboards and looking under Emma's bed as if searching for evidence of abuse. Emma had clung to Sarah's leg during those visits, her small fingers gripping her mother's jeans with desperate intensity. Then came the psychological evaluations. Emma had been taken to a sterile office where a woman with kind eyes but clinical demeanor had asked her questions in soft tones. Sarah wasn't allowed in the room. She'd sat outside, counting the tiles on the floor and wondering what her daughter was saying, whether Emma was frightened, whether she understood that all these questions were because adults were fighting about who got to keep her. The evaluations had been inconclusive. That's what the report said. Inconclusive. Emma's behavior suggested trauma, the psychologist wrote, but the source was unclear. She could be responding to conflict between her parents. She could be anxious about the custody proceedings. She could have early signs of selective mutism. The report was essentially a shrug, a professional "we're not sure," which somehow made everything worse. Uncertainty was a weapon Michael's lawyers could wield as effectively as any smoking gun. Sarah set the pasta on the table and forced a smile. "Dinner's ready, sweetheart," she said, keeping her voice bright and cheerful even though her insides felt like they were collapsing. Emma looked up at her mother with those huge, sad eyes that should belong to a carefree 3-year-old but instead seemed ancient with worry. "Is Daddy coming?" Emma asked quietly. It was one of the few questions she asked anymore. Sarah's heart broke all over again. No, baby, not tonight, just us. Emma nodded and returned her attention to her food. She ate 3 small bites and then stopped. She wasn't eating much these days. Sarah had mentioned it to her pediatrician, who'd suggested it was likely stress-related. Everything was stress-related now. Everything traced back to the custody battle consuming their lives. After dinner, Sarah ran Emma a bath, warming the water to just the right temperature. She added some purple bubble bath, Emma's favorite color, and watched as her daughter climbed into the tub. Sarah knelt beside the edge, watching Emma play with a yellow rubber duck, moving it through the water with mechanical motions that lacked joy. "You know Mommy loves you so much, right?" Sarah said, reaching out to brush a strand of hair from Emma's forehead. "More than anything in the whole world, you know that." Emma looked up at her mother and nodded, but she didn't smile. She didn't say, "I love you too," like she used to. She just looked sad and old beyond her years. That night after Emma was asleep, Sarah sat on her bed in the dark and cried. She cried for the childhood Emma was losing to adult problems. She cried for her own helplessness. She cried because she tried so hard to do everything right, to be enough, to give Emma stability and love despite their limited circumstances. And yet here she was, facing the very real possibility that the courts would decide she wasn't good enough. That a man with money and connections was a better parent simply because he could afford to appear so. The custody trial was scheduled to begin in 2 weeks. Sarah didn't sleep that night. She lay in the darkness, listening to Emma's occasional whimpers from the next room, and wondered how she would survive losing her daughter. More importantly, she wondered how Emma would survive it. The rain continued to fall outside, relentless and cold, matching the storm inside Sarah's breaking heart. The knock on the apartment door came at 9:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning. Sarah knew the exact time because she'd been staring at the microwave clock while Emma played with blocks in the living room. She'd been expecting this visit. James had warned her it was coming, but nothing could have prepared her for the actual experience of opening her door to find 2 caseworkers from Child Protective Services standing in her hallway with clipboards and professional masks of concern. "Mrs. Mitchell," the taller one asked, a woman in her 50s with gray-streaked hair and tired eyes that had clearly seen too much. "I'm Carol Henderson, and this is my colleague David Torres. We're here regarding the report filed by Michael Richardson. May we come in?" Sarah's stomach clenched. They didn't wait for a full invitation. They simply stepped inside, their eyes immediately scanning the apartment like hawks searching for prey. Sarah watched as they took in every detail. The mismatched furniture salvaged from thrift stores, the child safety locks on the kitchen cabinets, the stack of children's books in the corner, Emma's toys organized in labeled bins. She wanted to explain everything, to justify every choice, but she'd been warned by James not to volunteer information. "Just answer their questions. Be polite, don't get defensive." "Emma, sweetheart, can you come here for a moment?" Carol asked, her voice taking on the artificially sweet tone that adults use when they're trying to appear non-threatening. Emma looked at her mother, uncertainty flickering across her small face. Sarah nodded encouragingly, trying to project calm even as her heart hammered against her ribs. Emma set down her blocks and padded over to the caseworker. "Hi there, Emma," Carol said, kneeling down to the child's eye level. "I'm Carol. Do you like living here with your mom?" Emma nodded but didn't speak. Sarah could see the tension in her daughter's shoulders, the way her small fingers twisted together nervously. "Does your mom take good care of you?" Carol continued. "Yes," Emma whispered, barely audible. The questions continued for 20 minutes. "Has anyone ever hurt you? Do you feel safe? What does mommy do that makes you sad?" Emma answered in monosyllables, growing increasingly withdrawn with each question. Sarah could see her daughter shutting down, retreating into the protective shell she'd been building since the legal battle began. By the time Carol was finished, Emma had essentially stopped speaking entirely. David Torres, the male caseworker, spent time examining the apartment more thoroughly. He opened the refrigerator and made notes about the contents. He checked the bathroom for medications. He looked in Emma's room, opening drawers and examining her clothing and toys. Sarah followed him, trying not to feel like a criminal in her own home, trying to remember that this was supposed to protect children, that she should want them to see she had nothing to hide. "The apartment is small," David observed, writing something on his clipboard. "It's what we can afford," Sarah said carefully, trying to keep any defensiveness out of her voice. "But it's clean and safe. Emma has her own room." He nodded but didn't look convinced. Over the next 3 weeks, the investigation became the center of Sarah's universe. She received a call summoning her to CPS offices. She had to take time off work, losing wages she couldn't afford to lose, to sit in a gray conference room with Carol Henderson and a supervisor, answering questions about her parenting practices, her finances, her mental health, her relationship with Michael. "Do you suffer from depression?" the supervisor asked, a thin woman with sharp features. "I've been stressed about this custody case," Sarah answered carefully, "but I wouldn't say I suffer from depression." "The report filed by Mr. Richardson mentions that you've been emotionally unstable, that you've had episodes where you've been unable to care for Emma properly." "That's not true," Sarah said firmly. "I have never neglected my daughter. I work 2 jobs to provide for her. I read to her every night. I make sure she's healthy and happy." But even as she said the words, she wondered if they could hear the desperation in her voice, if they would interpret her passion as instability. The next summons came for Emma. Sarah had to take her to the CPS office again, where a different psychologist, this one younger, with kind eyes but an air of clinical detachment, conducted an evaluation. Sarah wasn't permitted in the room. She sat in the waiting area, flipping through magazines without reading them, her leg bouncing with anxiety. Every 30 minutes felt like an eternity. When Emma emerged from the evaluation room, she looked exhausted. The psychologist gave Sarah a copy of the preliminary assessment, which used terms like developmental trauma, selective mutism, and anxiety behaviors. The report suggested that Emma might be exhibiting symptoms of distress, but it couldn't determine the cause. Was it parental conflict, maternal neglect, simple childhood anxiety? The ambiguity was maddening. Michael's legal team, meanwhile, seemed energized by every development. They hired expert witnesses, child psychologists, financial analysts, and character witnesses who that Michael was stable, successful, and deeply committed to Emma's welfare. Sarah's public defender tried to counter these narratives, but he was clearly overworked and underprepared for the onslaught. The financial comparison was particularly damaging. Michael's attorney presented documents showing his 6-figure income, his spacious home in an upscale neighborhood, his ability to provide Emma with private schools, tutors, and every advantage money could buy. Then they presented Sarah's financial records, modest income, rent payments, the constant struggle to make ends meet. While Miss Mitchell clearly loves her daughter, Michael's lead attorney, a sharp-dressed man named Richard Thornton, said during one hearing, "One must question whether love is sufficient when considering the child's material welfare and developmental opportunities. Mr. Richardson can provide not just emotional support, but also superior education, health care, and life experiences." Sarah sat in the gallery, her hands clenched so tightly her nails left crescents in her palms. She wanted to scream that children don't need mansions and private schools. They need their mothers. They need someone who will sit with them through nightmares and celebrate their small victories and know exactly how they take their juice in the morning. But the courtroom operated by different rules, rules that seemed designed to favor those with resources. The CPS investigation continued for 6 more weeks. Home visits became routine. Sarah had to sign consent forms allowing caseworkers to interview her employers, her doctors, and even her neighbors. The neighbors, bless them, gave her glowing reviews, but she knew that didn't matter. The narrative had already been established. She was a struggling single mother, and Michael was a wealthy professional who wanted to give his daughter a better life. Emma, caught in the middle of this machinery, became increasingly anxious. She developed a nervous habit of twisting her hair and stopped making eye contact with adults. Her vocabulary seemed to contract. She ate less. She slept fitfully. And Sarah watched her daughter crumble, unable to stop it, unable to protect her from the system supposedly designed to protect her. The CPS investigation was technically closed without substantiated findings of abuse or neglect, but the lack of evidence against Sarah somehow didn't feel like a victory. It just meant the battlefield had shifted to the courtroom, where money and lawyers would decide Emma's fate. James hadn't slept more than 4 hours a night in the past 2 weeks. His small office at the Public Defender's Building was cluttered with case files, legal briefs, and empty coffee cups. The walls were covered with sticky notes and handwritten reminders, most of them marked with urgent exclamation points that felt increasingly meaningless. He'd been practicing law for 15 years, and he'd learned that justice didn't always prevail in family court. In fact, more often than not, it didn't. Money usually won. Resources usually won. Attractive people with convincing lawyers usually won. The Richardson v. Mitchell custody case was shaping up to be another loss, and James could feel it like a stone in his gut. He pulled up the case file on his computer screen for what felt like the 100th time that evening. Michael Richardson's financial records gleamed like polished brass. 6 figures, investment properties, a home in one of Indianapolis's most prestigious neighborhoods. Sarah Mitchell's records told a different story. 2 modest incomes, rent payments, groceries purchased strategically around payday. The judge would look at these numbers, and the decision would write itself. But what bothered James most wasn't the financial disparity. It was Emma. He'd met with Emma twice, once with Sarah present and once with a CPS caseworker observing. The child barely spoke. She seemed hollowed out, her eyes reflecting a trauma that went deeper than the custody battle itself. There was something about this little girl that haunted him. Maybe it was because he had a daughter of his own, a 6-year-old named Sophie who laughed easily and spoke in excited torrents about her day. Emma should be like that. Instead, she was slowly disappearing. The problem was that James had almost nothing concrete to work with. The CPS investigation had closed without substantiated findings. Michael had hired expert witnesses who would testify that Emma's anxiety was likely caused by her mother's instability and financial struggles. Sarah's history of working 2 jobs would be reframed as neglect. She wasn't home enough. The narrative would go. The apartment wasn't impressive. Sarah didn't have impressive credentials or impressive resources. All she had was love, and the court system didn't have a line item for love in its ledgers. Around midnight, James did something he rarely did. He stopped thinking like a lawyer bound by precedent and procedure, and he started thinking like a desperate man searching for a lifeline. He opened a browser and typed into the search bar, "Therapy Dogs Children Trauma Testimony." The results were scattered initially, some articles about emotional support animals, some studies on the benefits of animal-assisted therapy, nothing that seemed immediately applicable to a custody case. But then he found something. An article from a legal journal titled K9 Court, How Therapy Dogs Are Changing Testimony in Child Abuse Cases. James began reading, and with each paragraph, something shifted in his chest. The article described a program in California where specially trained therapy dogs had been allowed in courtrooms to provide emotional support to traumatized child witnesses. The results were remarkable. Children who had been nearly catatonic had found their voices. They'd been able to testify coherently and authentically about their experiences. The presence of the dog seemed to bypass their trauma responses, creating a safe enough internal space for them to speak truth. He clicked through to another article, and then another. There were studies showing that the presence of a dog could reduce cortisol levels, the stress hormone in children. There were case studies documenting how therapy dogs had helped children overcome selective mutism. There was even research suggesting that the physical act of touching a dog could ground a traumatized person in the present moment, making it easier for them to access memories and articulate experiences. James sat back in his chair, his mind racing. It was unconventional. It was risky. Judge Harold was traditional, by the book, and skeptical of anything that strayed from established courtroom protocol. He'd been presiding over cases for 32 years and had built his reputation on following procedures precisely. Asking him to allow a dog in his courtroom would be like asking him to conduct the trial in a circus. But what was the alternative? Sarah would lose Emma. Emma would be uprooted from the only stable home she'd ever known and placed with a father who'd shown minimal interest in parenting, until suddenly he needed to prove a point to his family or his new girlfriend or whatever had motivated this custody grab. James spent the next 3 days researching therapy dog programs in Indiana. He found Buddy's Haven, an organization in Indianapolis that specialized in training K-9s specifically for courtroom and therapeutic settings. The lead trainer was a woman named Doctor, a former child psychologist who transitioned into animal-assisted therapy after witnessing its transformative effects on traumatized children. James called her on a Friday afternoon. "I know how this sounds," he said after explaining the situation, "and I understand it's unconventional, but I have a 3-year-old client who's basically shut down. She's traumatized by a custody battle, and she needs to testify about her living situation with her mother. The court has found no evidence of abuse or neglect, but her father's resources are overwhelming the legal process. I think a therapy dog might help her access her voice." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "You're asking if we have a dog that could be present during actual courtroom testimony?" Doctor asked carefully. "I know it's a long shot," James said, "and I know the judge will probably refuse, but I have to try something. I have to give this child a chance." Doctor was quiet for another moment. Then she said, "We do have a dog. His name is Buddy. He's a 4-year-old golden retriever who was trained specifically for high-stress environments. He's worked with child witnesses before, never in an actual trial setting, but he has the temperament and training for it. The question is whether a judge would allow it." "I'll handle the judge," James said, though he had no idea if that was true. "Can I meet Buddy?" 2 days later, James sat in the training facility's office, watching a beautiful golden retriever move through a room with calm, deliberate grace. Buddy was trained to respond to anxiety signals. If a child became agitated, he would move closer and rest his head on their lap. He was trained not to bark, not to distract, not to demand attention. He was simply present, a warm, steady, non-judgmental presence in a room full of judgment. "Can he come to court?" James asked Doctor. "I won't lie to you," she said. "Most judges won't allow it. It violates their sense of courtroom decorum. But if you can convince the judge that it's in the best interest of the child, and if you can present research supporting its therapeutic value, there's a chance. Buddy has all the necessary certifications. He's impeccably trained. He won't cause any disruptions." James took a breath. It was a gamble, a big one. But then again, Sarah and Emma had already been gambling their entire future on a system that seemed stacked against them. That Monday, James filed a motion requesting that Buddy be allowed to remain in the courtroom during Emma's testimony as an emotional support animal. He attached research studies. He included doctors' credentials and certifications. He wrote a detailed explanation of Emma's trauma response and how the presence of a trained therapy dog could facilitate her ability to testify truthfully about her living situation. Judge Secretary called 3 days later. "The judge will see you in chambers," she said, "Thursday at 2 p.m. He wants to discuss your motion before trial." James hung up the phone and felt something shift. It wasn't hope exactly. He'd learned not to hope too much in family court. But it was the smallest crack of possibility, and in a case like this, that was everything. The Marion County Courthouse was an imposing structure of white limestone and dark glass, constructed in the 1970s with all the architectural charm of a tomb. Sarah stood outside it on Monday morning, November 3rd, watching news crews set up their cameras and reporters position themselves on the courthouse steps. The custody case of Richardson v. Mitchell had somehow captured the media's attention. not because it was remarkable, but because Michael Richardson came from a prominent Indianapolis family, and there was always interest when money and family drama intersected. Sarah wore her best dress, a navy blue outfit she'd purchased from a department store clearance rack 5 years ago. It was still professional looking, but James had warned her that appearance mattered in court. Michael had already arrived, stepping out of a black Mercedes with his lead attorney, Richard Thornton, a man who looked like he'd been sculpted from expensive cologne and confidence. His tailored suit probably cost more than Sarah's monthly rent. Emma clutched her mother's hand, her small fingers trembling slightly. She dressed Emma in a simple pink dress with white socks and black Mary Jane shoes, practical, neat, age-appropriate. But nothing could hide the darkness in her daughter's eyes, the way she seemed to be looking through the world rather than at it. Inside the courtroom, Judge Harold sat at his elevated bench with an expression of judicial impassivity. He was in his 60s, with silver hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to absolute authority. He'd already ruled on James's motion about Buddy. In the end, he'd permitted it, though his approval had come with visible reluctance and a list of conditions. The dog must remain on a mat beside the judge's bench, must make no sounds, must not distract from proceedings, and could only be present during Emma's testimony. It was a small victory, but James had taken it gratefully. Now, as the bailiff called the court to order and the gallery filled with spectators, Sarah felt her stomach turn to lead. The opposing counsel was already setting the stage with their opening statement. "Your Honor," Richard Thornton began, his voice resonating with the practiced cadence of someone who delivered thousands of courtroom speeches. "This case is fundamentally about one thing: a child's welfare. Michael Richardson is a successful businessman, a dedicated father, and a man committed to providing his daughter with the best possible upbringing. Emma deserves a stable home with adequate resources, proper education, and the kind of consistent parental presence that only a financially secure household can provide. We will present evidence that, while Sarah Mitchell loves her daughter, we do not contest that. She is simply unable to meet Emma's needs in the way that Mr. Richardson can." James stood for his opening but looked decidedly outmatched. He talked about love, about Sarah's devotion, about the importance of a child maintaining continuity with her primary caregiver. But his words seemed to dissipate in the air like smoke. The courtroom seemed designed to amplify wealth and diminish everything else. Michael took the stand first. He was composed and articulate, describing his professional accomplishments, his spacious home, his plans for Emma's future. He spoke about his concerns regarding Sarah's unstable living situation with practiced concern, never quite saying she was a bad mother, but implying it so effectively that the implication became the narrative. "I work long hours, Michael, but I make excellent income, which allows me to provide Emma with opportunities she simply cannot have in her current circumstances. I want her to attend excellent schools. I want her to have tutors if needed. I want her to have every advantage." The expert witnesses Michael's team had hired were impressive. A child psychologist that children thrive best in economically stable homes. A financial analyst presented data about the benefits of wealth on child development outcomes. A character witness, Michael's business partner, described him as devoted and stable. Each testimony built the portrait of a superior parent, each detail another brick in the wall separating Sarah from her daughter. During cross-examination, James tried to chip away at these testimonies, but he was swimming upstream against a current of resources and polish. Michael's team had research to support every claim. They had expert credentials. They had compelling narratives backed by data and professional analysis. Sarah's defense felt thin by comparison. James called her pediatrician, who that Emma was in good health and showed no signs of neglect. He called one of Sarah's neighbors, who spoke eloquently about Sarah's devotion to her daughter. But then Michael's attorneys cross-examined them with questions designed to highlight what Sarah couldn't provide: wealth, prestigious schools, opportunities. By the end of the first day, the momentum had shifted decisively toward Michael. Sarah could see it in the judge's expression, in the way he was taking notes, in the very air of the courtroom. She sat in the gallery, her hands shaking so badly she had to sit on them. The second day continued the pattern. More witnesses for Michael's side, more financial comparisons. The courtroom felt increasingly like a marketplace where a child's custody was being auctioned to the highest bidder. Sarah's attorney tried to fight, but it was like watching someone try to hold back the tide with their bare hands. By the third day, as Michael's attorney delivered yet another compelling closing statement about the superiority of Michael's resources and stability, Sarah felt something break inside her. She could see it happening. The judge's subtle shift in posture. The way he was looking at the documents presented by Michael's team. The trial was already decided. They were just going through the motions. Emma sat in a small chair near the gallery, the pink dress now looking rumpled and forlorn. She stared at the courtroom wall, seemingly disconnected from everything happening around her. Sarah wanted to reach over and hold her, but she'd been instructed by James to maintain composure. She couldn't appear emotional or unstable, so she sat rigidly, her heart disintegrating. On the fourth morning, as Michael's lead attorney began what seemed like an unstoppable closing argument, Richard Thornton was in full form. His voice carried the weight of inevitability. He spoke about Sarah's financial limitations, her modest apartment, her 2 jobs that left Emma in. He spoke about Michael's plans, his vision, his ability to provide. He spoke as if the decision had already been made, as if Sarah had already lost. The judge listened intently, occasionally making notes. Sarah watched her future disappear before her eyes. It was at this moment, as despair was settling over her like a suffocating blanket, that Emma suddenly shifted in her seat. For the first time in 3 days of trial, something changed in her posture. Her head turned slightly. Her eyes, those hollow, distant eyes, suddenly focused on something. It was Buddy, the therapy dog, resting calmly on his mat near the judge's bench. For the first time since arriving in that courtroom, Emma was looking at something with awareness. She was seeing something, truly seeing it, and in that small moment of connection, Sarah felt the tiniest spark of possibility. The judge called for a recess. The gavel came down with a sharp crack that seemed to echo through the entire courtroom. Judge leaned back in his chair and announced, "We'll take a 15-minute recess. Bailiff, please ensure the courtroom is cleared." Sarah watched the spectators and reporters file out, chattering among themselves as if they hadn't just witnessed the systematic dismantling of her custody rights. She sat motionless, unable to move, unable to think beyond the fog of despair that had settled over her mind. 15 more minutes. That's all that was left before the judge would likely announce his decision, and Sarah would lose her daughter. She glanced toward Emma, expecting to see the same vacant, disconnected expression her daughter had worn throughout the trial. But something was different. Emma was still in her chair, but her entire body had shifted. Her head was tilted, her eyes focused on something across the courtroom. Sarah followed her daughter's gaze and saw it, Buddy, the golden retriever, lying peacefully on his mat near the judge's bench. For 3 days, the dog had been present in the courtroom. For 3 days, Emma had been unconscious of his existence, lost in her own traumatized world. But now, in this moment when everything seemed lost, Emma's eyes had locked onto the dog with an intensity Sarah hadn't seen in weeks. James appeared at Sarah's side, his expression grave. "The judge is going to rule in his chambers," he said quietly. "He's going to announce his decision after this recess. I won't lie to you, Sarah, it doesn't look good. I'm sorry. I've done everything I can, but the financial and resource disparity is just too great." Sarah nodded numbly, not trusting herself to speak. She could feel tears threatening at the edges of her vision, but she forced them back. Not here. Not in front of all these people. Not in front of Emma, who was still staring at Buddy with an expression Sarah couldn't quite read. Judge stood and disappeared into his chambers with his bailiff. The courtroom began to empty more completely. The reporters stayed outside, likely discussing their angles for the inevitable story. Wealthy businessman wins custody of daughter. Single mother's modest means deemed insufficient. Sarah sat in the gallery, her vision blurring with unshed tears. She reached over and gently touched Emma's shoulder. "Come here, baby," she whispered. But Emma didn't move. Instead, the child's eyes remained fixed on Buddy. And then something extraordinary happened. Emma stood up from her chair, something she hadn't initiated on her own in weeks, and she began to walk, not toward her mother, not toward James, but toward the dog. Sarah's breath caught. "Emma, wait," she started to stand, but James put a hand on her arm. "Let her go," he said softly. "Just for a moment, let her go." Emma moved across the emptying courtroom like someone in a trance, her small feet carrying her toward Buddy. The dog, sensing the child's approach, lifted his head, but he didn't move from his mat. He simply waited, his dark eyes observing Emma with a kind of patient understanding. Sarah watched, barely breathing, as her 3-year-old daughter reached the mat where Buddy lay. For a moment, nothing happened. Emma stood there, looking down at the dog. Then slowly, she reached out one small hand and touched Buddy's golden fur. The dog didn't bark. He didn't jump up or demand attention. He simply pressed his large head gently against Emma's tiny hand, as if acknowledging her, greeting her, telling her without words that she was safe here. Emma's rigid posture began to soften. Her small hand moved from Buddy's head to his neck, stroking the silky fur with tentative, wondering movements. And then something shifted in the child's chest. Her breathing seemed to deepen. Her shoulders dropped slightly, releasing tension that had been knotted there for months. The bailiff started to intervene to direct Emma back to her seat, but James raised his hand. "Please," he said, "let her have this moment." Emma continued to stroke Buddy's fur, and slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, her lips began to move. Sarah leaned forward, straining to hear what her daughter was saying. At first, there was nothing but breath, but then, so quietly that Sarah almost missed it, Emma began to whisper. "Hi, Buddy," Emma said, her voice barely audible. It was the first unprompted sentence she'd spoken to anyone in 3 days. "You're soft." Sarah felt something crack open inside her chest. Her daughter was speaking. Emma was speaking. The child continued stroking the dog, and her whispers became slightly louder. "Mommy says you help people. Are you helping me?" Buddy leaned into Emma's touch, and the girl rested her small forehead against the dog's neck, holding him like he was the most precious thing in the world. For the first time since the custody battle began, Emma's rigid posture completely released. Her small body softened against Buddy's warm, solid form. "I miss Mommy," Emma whispered into the dog's fur. "I don't want to leave Mommy." Sarah's hand flew to her mouth, tears streaming down her face now. Those were the words she'd been waiting to hear. Not because they proved anything about the custody case. They didn't, not legally. But because they were Emma's voice, Emma's truth, breaking through the trauma that had silenced her for so long. James was watching intently, and Sarah could see something shift in his expression too, a spark of hope, fragile but present. The bailiff cleared his throat. "The judge will be returning soon," he said, addressing Emma gently. "We need you to return to your seat, sweetheart." Emma reluctantly pulled away from Buddy, her small hand lingering on the dog's fur for one more moment. As she walked back toward her seat, she looked at her mother. And for the first time in weeks, Emma's eyes weren't hollow. They weren't disconnected. They were present. They were searching Sarah's face with an intensity that made Sarah's heart ache. Sarah opened her arms and Emma climbed into her lap, burying her face in her mother's chest. The child's small body trembled against Sarah, and Sarah held her tightly, stroking her hair, whispering reassurances. "I'm here, baby. Mommy's here. I'm not going anywhere." But even as she said the words, Sarah didn't know if they were true. The trial was about to conclude. The judge was about to announce his ruling. But something had shifted. Emma had found her voice, even if only for a moment. She had connected with Buddy in a way that seemed to bypass her trauma, and in that connection, she had remembered what mattered. The bailiff called everyone back into the courtroom. Judge emerged from his chambers and took his seat at the bench. The galleries began to fill again with reporters and spectators, sensing that the ruling was about to be announced. But before the judge could speak, before the verdict could be delivered, James stood and made an urgent request. "Your Honor, I need to request something. Given the recent developments with the therapeutic dog, I would like to request permission for Emma to testify while Buddy remains present. I believe it's in the best interest of the child." Judge looked up from his papers, his expression unreadable. "Request noted," he said, "but we'll proceed with my ruling now." Sarah's hope flickered and nearly died. She held Emma, preparing for the worst. Judge set down his papers and looked over the rim of his reading glasses at James. His expression was stern, but there was something else there too, a flicker of something that might have been recognition, or perhaps reconsideration. "Mister," the judge said, his voice carrying the weight of courtroom authority, "you're asking me to deviate from standard procedure based on what exactly? A momentary connection between a child and an animal." James stood, and Sarah could see him gathering his courage. "Your Honor, with all due respect, that momentary connection produced the first voluntary, unprompted speech this child has offered in 3 days of proceedings. More importantly, it produced the first genuine emotional expression we've witnessed from Emma since this custody battle began. I have research supporting the therapeutic value of trained K9s in facilitating testimony from traumatized children. Doctor, who trained Buddy, is available to testify about his qualifications and the scientific basis for his presence." Richard Thornton stood immediately. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. We're introducing a dog into the courtroom as if this were some kind of therapeutic session rather than a legal proceeding. The child's momentary interest in the animal proves nothing about her living situation or her mother's fitness as a parent." But Judge raised his hand, silencing the opposition. He removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes, a gesture that suggested a man wrestling with something internal. He'd presided over family court for 3 decades. He'd seen countless custody battles. He'd heard expert testimony and financial analyses and psychological evaluations. But he'd also, Sarah suspected, learned to recognize when the machinery of law was potentially grinding up something precious. "Recess," the judge announced suddenly. 1 hour. Everyone except Sarah Mitchell, James, Michael Richardson, and Mr. Thornton is to vacate the courtroom. The gallery emptied quickly. Reporters rushed out, likely to file updates on their stories. Spectators filtered away, disappointed to miss the ruling. The bailiff ushered out the remaining witnesses. Within minutes, only the 4 adults remained in the large courtroom, along with Buddy, still lying calmly on his mat. Judge descended from his bench and walked to the mat where Buddy rested. He studied the dog for a long moment, then looked at Emma, who was still sitting in her mother's lap, occasionally glancing toward the dog. "Tell me about this dog," the judge said to no one in particular. Doctor, who'd been sitting in the gallery, stood and approached. "Your Honor, may I speak?" The judge gestured her forward. Doctor explained Buddy's training, his certifications, the research supporting animal-assisted therapy in high-stress situations. She described how dogs could help traumatized children access emotional states that allowed for more authentic communication. She spoke with quiet authority, her credentials and experience evident in every word. Judge listened without interrupting. When Doctor finished, he turned to Sarah. "Mrs. Mitchell, in your honest opinion, would your daughter benefit from having the dog present if she were to testify?" Sarah's heart raced. This was dangerous territory. Acknowledging that Emma needed help could be used against her, suggesting her daughter was too traumatized to be in her care. But it was also the truth, and Sarah had learned that sometimes truth was the only card worth playing. "Yes," Sarah said quietly, Emma has been so frightened and confused by all of this. She loves animals. I've seen how she responded to Buddy just now. For the first time in weeks, she seemed present, like herself. Judge nodded slowly. And how long have you been separated from your daughter during this process, Mrs. Mitchell? We live together, Sarah said. But we've been separated during the investigation and court proceedings. During the CPS evaluation, the psychological examination. It's been incredibly hard on her. The judge turned to Michael. Mr. Richardson, do you have any objection to your daughter testifying with the dog present, provided the testimony is conducted properly? Michael's jaw tightened. Sarah could see him calculating, trying to determine if this would help or hurt his case. Your Honor, I don't believe the child's preference for a pet should override the legal process. However, if it facilitates her testimony, I suppose I can accept it. It wasn't a ringing endorsement, but it was permission. Judge looked at his watch. We'll reconvene in 1 hour. I want Doctor to remain available. I want James to prepare his client for testimony. And I want Emma to have some time with the dog, away from the courtroom in a calm environment. Bailiff, is there a private room we can use? The bailiff nodded and led the group to a small conference room adjacent to the courtroom. It was a plain space with a table and chairs, but it was quiet and private, a sanctuary compared to the formal intimidation of the courtroom. Emma, Judge said gently, kneeling to the child's eye level, would you like to spend some time with Buddy? Emma looked at her mother, uncertainty crossing her small face. Sarah nodded encouragingly. It's okay, baby. You can spend time with Buddy. Doctor released Buddy from his formal restraint, and the dog padded over to Emma with his characteristic calm demeanor. Emma, emboldened by this permission, began to reach for him. Unlike in the courtroom, there was no formality now, no performance. It was just a frightened child and a compassionate dog. Emma wrapped her small arms around Buddy's neck, and the dog leaned into her embrace. She began to whisper to him again, and this time, Sarah could hear her more clearly. My daddy said Mommy doesn't love me right, Emma whispered into Buddy's fur. But that's not true. Mommy reads to me every night. Mommy sings to me. Mommy makes me breakfast. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face. This was the truth Emma had been unable to articulate in 3 days of testimony and evaluation. My daddy's house is big, Emma continued, but it's scary. He yells a lot. He yells at his girlfriend. He yells on the phone. I don't like it there. Doctor was taking notes, but she wasn't interfering. She was simply documenting what a traumatized child was expressing in the safety of an animal's presence. I want to stay with Mommy, Emma said, her voice growing stronger now. Mommy is safe. Buddy, Mommy is safe. For the next 40 minutes, Emma sat with Buddy, her small body gradually releasing the tension that had held it rigid for so long. She talked about her mother's apartment, which was small but warm. She talked about her favorite books that Mommy read to her. She talked about feeling scared when Daddy got angry. She talked about missing her mother during the long days of investigation and court. And with each word, something shifted. Emma's voice became clearer. Her demeanor became more present. The trauma was still there, but it was no longer silencing her. When the hour was nearly up, James leaned toward Sarah and whispered, if Emma can maintain even half of this clarity in the courtroom, her testimony could change everything. The judge needs to hear this. The court needs to hear this. Sarah stroked her daughter's hair as Emma continued to nestle against Buddy. I know, baby, she said. You're going to be so brave. The bailiff appeared at the door. The judge is ready to resume, he announced. Emma looked up at her mother, then at Buddy. The dog pressed his forehead gently against the child's cheek, a gesture of comfort and reassurance. Come on, sweetheart, Sarah said, lifting Emma into her arms. Let's go tell everyone the truth. Courtroom had been reconvened and refilled with spectators and reporters who'd been waiting in the hallway. There was an electricity in the air now, a sense that something significant was about to happen. The judge had made it clear that Emma would be testifying, and the presence of Buddy on his mat near the bench had sparked whispered conversations among the gallery. Buddy lay calmly, his golden fur gleaming under the courtroom lights. Judge sat at his bench, watching Emma with an expression that suggested a man bracing himself for something important. Sarah held Emma's hand as they approached the witness stand. Emma was small enough that she needed a cushion to see over the edge of the stand's desk. The bailiff arranged it carefully, treating the 3-year-old with a gentleness that suggested even the formal machinery of the court recognized the vulnerability of this witness. "Emma," Judge said softly, "do you understand that you're supposed to tell the truth?" Emma nodded slowly, her eyes darting toward Buddy, finding reassurance in the dog's solid, peaceful presence. "Can you say yes or no so the court reporter can hear you?" the judge asked. "Yes," Emma said, her voice barely above a whisper, but it was audible, it was clear. James stood and approached his young witness. "Emma, I want to ask you some questions about where you live. Is that okay?" "Okay," Emma said, her small fingers gripping the edge of the witness stand. "Tell me about your home, the place where you live with your mommy." Emma was quiet for a moment. Sarah held her breath, terrified that her daughter would freeze, that the trauma would reclaim her, that this fragile moment of clarity would shatter. But then Emma began to speak. "It's small," she said, "but it's pretty. Mommy has flowers in the window, they're yellow, and there's pictures of me on the walls. Mommy draws pictures with me and hangs them up." Several reporters in the gallery were scribbling notes. Michael's attorney watched with narrowed eyes. "Does your mommy take care of you?" James asked gently. "Yes," Emma said firmly. "Mommy makes my breakfast, Mommy makes my lunch, Mommy makes my dinner." "What kinds of things does your mommy do with you?" "We read books," Emma said, and now her voice was growing stronger, more confident. "Mommy reads to me every night. We have stories about princesses and animals and adventures. Mommy does funny voices. She does a big voice for the bears and a tiny voice for the baby bear." Sarah felt tears begin to stream down her face. This was Emma talking about their bedtime ritual, the one constant anchor in her daughter's day, the one thing that transcended all the chaos and legal battles. "Does your mommy love you?" James asked. "Yes," Emma said without hesitation. "Mommy loves me so much. She tells me every day, she says, 'Emma, you are my favorite person in the whole world.' Every day she says that." There was a subtle shift in the courtroom. Some of the reporters were no longer writing. They were simply watching, listening, witnessing something that transcended the usual adversarial nature of legal proceedings. "Emma, I want to ask you about your daddy. Do you spend time with him?" Emma's small body tensed slightly. Her eyes flickered toward Buddy again, seeking stability. "Sometimes," she said quietly. "His house is big." "Is his house nice?" James asked. "It's big," Emma repeated, and there was something significant in her repetition. "But it's not nice like Mommy's house. At Daddy's house he yells. He yells a lot." Michael's attorney stood. "Objection, Your Honor. The child is making assumptions about the nature of normal conversation." But Judge raised his hand. "I'll allow it. Please continue, mister." "Emma, when your daddy yells, how does that make you feel?" Emma's lower lip began to tremble. Her small hand reached out over the edge of the witness stand, and Doctor, who was standing nearby, gently guided her toward the mat where Buddy lay. The judge didn't object. Emma climbed down from the stand, the bailiff assisting her, and wrapped her arms around Buddy's neck. The courtroom was completely silent now. Even the air seemed to have stilled. "It makes me scared," Emma said into Buddy's fur. "Daddy yells at his girlfriend. He yells on the phone. He yells about work. Sometimes he yells at me. It's loud and scary and I don't like it." "Have you ever felt scared at your mommy's house?" James asked gently. Emma pulled back from Buddy and shook her head firmly. "No, Mommy's house is safe. Mommy is safe. Mommy never yells at me." Michael's attorney stood again, but Judge silenced him with a look. "The child is testifying," he said, his voice carrying absolute authority. "You will have your opportunity for cross-examination." "Emma," James continued, "if you had to choose, where would you want to live?" Emma didn't hesitate. She didn't look confused or uncertain. She simply said very clearly, "With Mommy. I want to live with Mommy." "Why do you want to live with your mommy?" "Because Mommy loves me," Emma said. "Mommy takes care of me. Mommy makes me feel safe, and Mommy sings to me." She began to hum then, a simple melody, and Sarah recognized it immediately. It was a lullaby she sang to Emma every night, a song about a little girl who was loved so much that the stars came out just to see her smile. Emma continued humming, stroking Buddy's soft fur, and there wasn't a person in the courtroom who wasn't deeply moved by it. The reporters had stopped writing. Michael's expression had shifted from confident to something more uncertain. Even Judge seemed to be struggling with his composure. When Emma finished humming, she looked directly at her father for the first time since she'd taken the stand. "I don't want to live with Daddy," she said simply. "I want to live with Mommy." Michael's face darkened. He started to stand, as if to object to his daughter's testimony, but his attorney pulled him back down. James looked at Judge. "I have no further questions, Your Honor." "Cross-examination?" the judge asked, though his tone suggested he was reluctant to put this child through any further questioning. Richard Thornton stood slowly. He approached Emma with a careful expression, clearly aware that any aggressive questioning would look devastating in front of a courtroom full of observers and reporters. "Emma," he said, his voice artificially gentle, "you mentioned that your father has a big house. Doesn't a big house give you more room to play?" "I guess," Emma said, "but I like Mommy's apartment better." "Why is that?" "Because Mommy is there," Emma said simply. "That's what makes a place good, not how big it is. If Mommy is there, it's good." Thornton tried a few more questions, but he was fighting an uphill battle. Every answer Emma gave was honest, clear, and emotionally resonant. She wasn't being coached. She wasn't performing. She was simply being a 3-year-old expressing her truth. Finally, Thornton gave up. "No further questions," he said, sitting down. Judge called for a recess, and Emma was led back to Sarah, who scooped her daughter into her arms and held her so tightly she was afraid she might be hurting her. But Emma didn't pull away. She buried her face in her mother's neck and began to cry, deep, cleansing sobs that suggested she was finally releasing months of tension and fear. The courtroom erupted. Reporters rushed toward the exits. Photographers snapped pictures. But Sarah heard none of it. She was focused only on the child in her arms, on the weight of her daughter's small body, on the truth that had finally been spoken. Judge looked down at the pair with an expression that no longer held judicial distance. He simply looked like an old man who just witnessed something sacred. "We'll reconvene in 30 minutes for final statements," he announced. "Then I will render my decision." Retry A. The 30-minute recess passed in a blur of emotions and whispered conversations. Sarah sat with Emma in a private room, holding her daughter, occasionally offering her sips of water. Emma's tears had subsided, replaced by an exhausted calm. The child's small body seemed lighter somehow, as if she'd set down a burden she'd been carrying for months. Doctor brought Buddy in for a few final moments of comfort. Emma immediately brightened, wrapping her arms around the dog's neck. "Thank you, Buddy," she whispered. "Thank you for helping me tell the truth." James appeared in the doorway, his expression carefully neutral, but Sarah could see something hopeful in his eyes. "The judge is about to announce his decision," he said. "We should head back to the courtroom." The gallery was packed even more densely than before. News of Emma's testimony had spread through the courthouse like wildfire. Everyone wanted to witness the outcome. Sarah held Emma's hand as they walked back to the courtroom. Her daughter was walking taller now, her steps more confident. The weight of silence had lifted. Judge took his seat at the bench. The entire courtroom fell silent. Even the reporters seemed to sense that something momentous was about to occur. "This case," Judge began, removing his glasses and setting them on the bench before him, "has presented me with many legal considerations. Financial records, expert testimony, professional qualifications, and conventional wisdom all pointing in a particular direction. However, it has also presented me with something far more important: a child's voice. A truth spoken not through the filter of legal strategy or professional analysis, but through the pure, unguarded testimony of a 3-year-old who simply wanted to tell us what she knows." Michael shifted in his seat, his earlier confidence now completely evaporated. "I have presided over family court for 32 years, Judge continued. I have seen cases where money appeared to be the deciding factor. I have seen brilliant attorneys make compelling arguments for their clients, but I have rarely seen a moment as clarifying as what occurred in this courtroom this afternoon. A traumatized child, given access to an instrument of healing, was able to articulate her truth with a clarity that transcended all the legal arguments that have been presented to me." The judge leaned forward, his hands folded before him. "Wealth is not a substitute for love. A spacious home is not superior to a modest apartment where a child feels safe and cherished. Expert testimony about developmental psychology cannot override the authentic voice of a child expressing her lived experience. Emma Mitchell has never been neglected by her mother. She has never been unsafe in her mother's care. She has, in fact, been raised by a woman who works 2 jobs, sacrifices constantly, and pours every ounce of her energy into her daughters." Sarah felt James squeeze her arm. Tears were streaming down her face. "Furthermore," the judge continued, "I note that Emma's anxiety and trauma responses appear directly correlated with the stress of this custody battle and her exposure to her father's home environment. The child expressed fear in response to her father's anger, and she expressed safety and security in her mother's presence. As the primary caregiver, Sarah Mitchell has earned the right to continue in that role." Judge paused, and the entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. "My ruling is as follows. Sarah Mitchell is awarded full physical and legal custody of Emma Richardson Mitchell. Michael Richardson is granted supervised visitation only, to be arranged through a family services coordinator. Furthermore, Michael Richardson is ordered to complete court-mandated parenting classes and anger management counseling before unsupervised visitation will be considered. Additionally, a restraining order is issued preventing Mr. Richardson from engaging in any further harassment or legal action against Mrs. Mitchell regarding custody matters." The gavel came down. For a moment the courtroom seemed frozen. Then chaos erupted. Reporters surged toward Sarah, shouting questions. Photographers' cameras flashed, but Sarah heard none of it. She was focused only on Emma, who looked up at her with dawning comprehension. "Mommy," Emma said. "We get to stay together, baby," Sarah said, lifting her daughter into her arms. "We get to stay together, forever." Emma wrapped her small arms around her mother's neck and began to cry again. But these were different tears. These were tears of relief, of release, of a burden finally lifted. James was shaking Sarah's hand, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You did it," he said. "Emma did it. She saved herself." Michael stood abruptly, his face flushed with anger, but his attorney pulled him toward the exit before he could say anything that would further damage his case. Sarah watched him go without triumph or vindication. She simply felt grateful that her daughter would no longer have to endure his anger. Doctor approached with Buddy, who seemed to sense the shift in the emotional atmosphere. The dog pressed gently against Sarah's leg, his presence a final benediction. "Buddy knows," Doctor said with a gentle smile. "He knows that his work here is done, and he did it beautifully." Sarah knelt down and hugged the dog, tears flowing freely now. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for giving my daughter back her voice." Over the next week, the story spread beyond the Indianapolis courthouse. Local news outlets ran segments about the therapy dog who'd helped a traumatized child find her voice. National news picked it up. Legal professionals began citing the case as an example of how unconventional approaches could sometimes serve justice better than traditional methods. Judge received letters from child advocates and psychologists praising his willingness to adapt courtroom procedure for a child's. But for Sarah and Emma, the victory meant something far more intimate and personal. On the first morning after the ruling, Sarah woke to find Emma standing in her doorway, backlit by the early morning light. The child was smiling, a real, genuine smile that reached all the way to her eyes. "Hi, Mommy," Emma said. "Hi, baby," Sarah replied, pulling her daughter into bed beside her. "How are you feeling?" "Happy," Emma said simply. "I'm happy." Over the following weeks, Emma's transformation was remarkable. She began to eat more. The dark circles under her eyes faded. Her vocabulary expanded. She laughed again. That infectious, innocent laugh that Sarah had feared was gone forever. She sang in the apartment, played with toys, and asked questions about the world with the curiosity of a healthy 3-year-old. Sarah continued working her 2 jobs, but the work no longer felt like desperate survival. It felt like investment in a future she was confident they would share together. She made plans to eventually go back to school, to expand her career opportunities, to build the kind of stability that would allow her to give Emma even more. One evening, Sarah received a call from Dr. "I wanted to let you know," she said warmly, "that Buddy has been recommended for a state program recognizing therapy animals who made significant contributions to legal proceedings. He'll be honored at a ceremony next month. I thought Emma might like to attend." Emma was thrilled by the invitation. On the day of the ceremony, she wore a special dress, not the blue one from court, but a new yellow one that made her smile when she put it on. At the ceremony, Emma presented Buddy with a medal, her small hands shaking slightly with pride and emotion. "Buddy helped me tell the truth," Emma said into the microphone, her voice clear and strong. "Buddy helped me find my voice. Buddy helped me stay with my mommy." The room erupted in applause. Buddy, with his characteristic calm, leaned his head against Emma's leg, as if acknowledging the role she'd played in her own salvation. Later that evening, as Sarah tucked Emma into bed, her daughter asked, "Mommy, will Buddy come visit us?" "We can visit Buddy anytime we want," Sarah promised. "He's part of our story now. He's part of our family." Emma smiled and closed her eyes, drifting off to sleep with a peaceful expression that suggested she was finally, truly safe. Sarah sat on the edge of her daughter's bed in their small apartment, watching the rise and fall of Emma's breathing, and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: profound gratitude. Not just for the legal victory, though that mattered, but for her daughter's voice, for the therapists and advocates who'd fought for them, for a dog who'd quietly communicated what no words could express, and for a judge wise enough to recognize that sometimes justice requires stepping outside the rules. As she closed Emma's bedroom door softly and returned to the living room, Sarah looked out the window at the Indianapolis skyline. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Life would continue with all its complications and uncertainties. But tonight, in this small apartment with yellow flowers in the window, a mother and daughter were together. They were safe. They were home. And that was everything. The end.